Elderly man risks his life to save a canine German Shepherd from a wolf pack. Then something heartbreaking happens. A snow-covered forest. The cries of a wounded dog echo through the trees. And then, an elderly man, alone and unarmed, charges into the darkness, not to protect himself, but to save a canine German Shepherd surrounded by a pack of hungry wolves. Everyone said he was crazy. Everyone told him to stay out of it. But what happened next was more than anyone could have imagined. A story of courage, devotion, and a twist so tragic it will leave you breathless. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss any of our emotional, inspiring stories about the unbreakable bond between humans and canine heroes. Let's dive into this unforgettable journey. The wind howled through the pines like a warning. Snow blanketed the Montana wilderness, heavy and silent, save for the sound that pierced through the white. A desperate, ragged bark. It echoed off the trees like a cry for help. And for Walter Briggs, it was impossible to ignore. 80 years old and living alone since his wife passed, Walter had always preferred the solitude of his cabin in the forest. He had served in the Marines, spent decades as a park ranger, and now filled his quiet days chopping wood, sipping black coffee, and reminiscing with photos of better times. But that bark, it stirred something in him. It wasn't just the sound of an ordinary dog. It was controlled but urgent. Trained, not wild. Like a soldier calling for backup. Walter grabbed his coat, loaded his old rifle, just in case, and headed out into the snow, his boots crunching softly against the white powder. The temperature was well below freezing, and every step deeper into the woods reminded him that he wasn't the man he used to be. His knees ached. His breath steamed from his lungs in labored puffs. Still, he pressed on, drawn by the sound. After half an hour of following the tracks and distant barking, he saw it. A clearing ahead, circled by trees blackened by snow and shadow. And in the middle of it, a German Shepherd, large, scarred, its dark eyes full of panic, stood its ground against 3 circling wolves. Walter froze. Time seemed to stop. The canine's left hind leg was bleeding, and it was barely holding itself upright, yet it faced the wolves without flinching. A working dog, trained for battle, abandoned, lost? Walter didn't know. But he knew loyalty when he saw it. That dog was ready to die standing. One of the wolves lunged. The shepherd barked and snapped, but staggered. Walter didn't think. He raised his rifle and fired a warning shot into the sky. The thunder cracked through the forest, scattering the birds and making the wolves flinch. 2 of them backed off, growling, but one, the largest, turned its yellow gaze on Walter. Walter stared back. He had survived war. He had buried a wife. He had no children left, no family nearby. He had little left to lose. So he did what no one expected. He stepped into the clearing, between the shepherd and the wolf. "Go on then," he muttered to the beast, voice low but steady. "You'll have to get through me first." The wolf snarled, but hesitated. Walter didn't move, rifle ready but unfired. The German Shepherd whimpered behind him, shivering. The standoff lasted seconds, maybe minutes. Eventually, the wolves melted back into the trees, driven off by the gunshot, the scent of human defiance, or fate itself. Walter dropped to one knee, heart pounding, and looked the shepherd in the eye. The dog didn't growl. Instead, it nudged forward, resting its muzzle gently against Walter's glove. He saw it then, barely visible under the snow-matted fur. A faded collar tag with a military emblem. This wasn't just a German Shepherd. This was a K9, a soldier. Lost, wounded, forgotten. "You're one of ours," Walter whispered. "And no one came back for you." The shepherd licked his hand once and collapsed. Walter didn't hesitate. He bundled the dog into his coat, cradled him like a child, and began the long, aching walk back to his cabin. Every step was pain. Every breath was ice. But he didn't stop. Not for himself, not for the dog. As the door creaked open and he laid the K9 gently by the fireplace, Walter didn't realize just how much this single act would change everything. He had saved a life. But in doing so, he had set in motion a heartbreaking chain of events, and he had no idea what was coming next. The fire crackled softly inside the cabin, casting long, flickering shadows across the wooden walls. Walter sat on the floor beside the German shepherd, wrapping the dog in a thick wool blanket. His hands, weathered by time and labor, moved with unexpected gentleness. The dog was breathing, shallow but steady, and its leg wound had stopped bleeding after Walter had cleaned it with warm water and wrapped it tightly. Walter hadn't had a guest in years. Now, lying beside his hearth, was a war dog, a forgotten soldier. The shepherd hadn't made a sound since collapsing. No bark, no growl, not even a whine. Just quiet breaths and tired, dark eyes that followed Walter's every move. There was something in those eyes, something that reminded Walter of men he'd seen in war. Not fear, something worse, something deeper. Loss. Walter poured a cup of lukewarm coffee and sat down in the old armchair across from the dog. Outside, the snow continued to fall, muffling the world in silence. Inside, only the fire and Walter's voice broke the quiet. "You got a name, boy?" he asked softly. The dog didn't respond, only blinked. Walter reached for the faded collar again. The tag was old, scratched, almost unreadable. But he managed to make out the letters, K9 Max. There was also a serial number and the faint symbol of the U.S. Army. "Max," Walter repeated. "That's a good name. You're one of the good ones, aren't you?" Max gave the faintest flick of his ear, as if acknowledging the sound. Walter smiled. A small thing, but it was something. Over the next 2 days, Walter nursed Max back to a fragile state of health. He gave him warm food, mostly chicken and bone broth, and let him rest by the fire, speaking to him constantly, as if conversation could heal what medicine could not. "I know what it's like," he said one evening, his voice low, his hand resting gently on Max's side. "To survive something, only to come back and find everything's changed. People forget. Or maybe they just don't know how to look at you anymore." Max still didn't bark, but he never took his eyes off Walter. By the 4th day, Max stood on his own. It wasn't graceful. His hind leg shook under his weight, and he limped, but he managed to cross the cabin and nuzzle Walter's knee. The old man chuckled, wiping a tear before it could fall. "That's right," he whispered. "You're not done yet, not by a long shot." That afternoon, Walter called the nearest ranger station to report the dog. He didn't want to. He'd grown attached. But Max had served. He deserved a proper home, recognition, care. The ranger, a young woman named Dana, agreed to come the next day with a vet to examine Max and possibly trace his military file. Walter hung up the phone slowly, the receiver shaking slightly in his hand. He looked at Max, now resting with his head on a folded quilt. "They might take you, boy, but I'll fight like hell if they try to put you down. You hear me?" Max blinked once, then let out a soft sigh, the first sound he'd made since collapsing in the snow. That night, Walter didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, watching Max dream. The dog's legs twitched in his sleep, a soft whimper escaping his throat. Walter recognized that sound too well. Nightmares. Ghosts that came when everything else was still. In the early hours before dawn, Max stood suddenly, limped to Walter's side, and pressed his head into the old man's chest. Walter's heart swelled, and for the first time in years, he wept. Not for himself, not for the loneliness, but for the broken soul that had found its way into his cabin, a soul just like his. He hugged Max close and whispered, "You're home now. For as long as I'm breathing, you're not going anywhere." But the dawn that followed would not bring peace, because something tragic waited just beyond the tree line, something neither Walter nor Max could see coming. By morning, the forest seemed calmer. Sunlight shimmered across the snow like scattered glass, but the chill still hung heavy in the air. Inside the cabin, Walter was sipping coffee, while Max lay curled up near the fire, eyes half open, alert yet tired. The old man glanced down at the dog, still amazed by how quickly trust had formed between them. "You sleep better last night?" he asked. Max gave a low grunt, not quite a bark, more of a reply. Walter smiled. It was the first real sound Max had made since arriving. Something in the dog's demeanor had changed. He was still cautious, still scarred, but no longer distant. He had begun to lean into Walter's hand when it rested on his head. He didn't flinch at sudden noises. And most of all, he never let Walter out of his sight. When the knock came at the door, Max bolted upright. Walter stood slowly and opened it to find Ranger Dana and a young veterinarian, both wrapped in thick parkas, standing with snow still clinging to their boots. Dana's eyes softened when she saw Max. "Well, you weren't kidding," she said. "That's a K9, all right." Max didn't bark or growl, but stood firm beside Walter, as if silently asking, who are they and why are they here? "It's okay," Walter whispered. "They just want to help." The vet knelt slowly, extending a hand. Max hesitated, but didn't back away. After some gentle coaxing, the vet managed to scan the microchip buried beneath the fur on Max's neck. "His name is Max," the vet confirmed. "Army K9, deployed twice to Afghanistan. Handler was Sergeant Dean Rhodes." She looked up at Walter. "It says here Max was reported killed in action 3 months ago." Walter's stomach turned. "Killed?" Dana frowned, reading over the file. "Looks like the base was attacked. Max went missing during the chaos. They assumed he was taken by insurgents or died in the blast." "But he didn't," Walter said, voice thick with disbelief. "He made it out, crossed who knows how many miles, and no one ever came looking?" The vet lowered her tablet. "No one expected a dog to make it back through enemy territory." Max sat quietly, staring at the open door, the trees beyond, as if remembering the journey, the gunfire, the explosions, the long, hungry nights. "He's been through hell," Dana said. "But he survived." Walter knelt beside Max. "Because he's a fighter." For a moment, the room was silent. Just the pop of the fire and the weight of what they'd all just learned. Then Dana cleared her throat. "There's more. Max's handler, Sergeant Rhodes. He made it out too. He's at a VA hospital in Denver, recovering. They thought Max died in his arms." Walter blinked, overcome. "Does he know Max is alive?" "Not yet," Dana said softly. "I think you should be the one to tell him." The plan was set into motion. Dana would make the calls. The vet would arrange safe transport. Walter would accompany Max to Denver. He insisted. He wouldn't let the dog go without him. Not after everything they'd been through. But as the sun began to set that evening, and Walter packed a small duffel bag for the trip, Max suddenly grew restless. He paced, whimpered, then limped to the window and let out a low, rumbling growl. Walter followed his gaze. There, on the edge of the trees, a flicker of movement. Shadows. Wolves. They had returned. Walter's blood ran cold. He stepped outside with his rifle, boots sinking into the snow, and fired a warning shot. The sound cracked through the forest like thunder. The wolves vanished, for now. But the message was clear. They had followed the scent. They remembered the dog, And they weren't done. Inside the cabin, Max was trembling, not from fear, but instinct. He sat at the door, rigid and alert, his gaze locked on the forest. "We leave at first light," Walter whispered, locking the door and setting the rifle by his bed. "We've got one more battle ahead of us." Neither of them slept much that night. Not because of fear, but because they both knew survival had brought them this far. But fate hadn't finished testing them yet. The night crawled by, thick with tension. Walter sat upright in his chair by the fire, rifle across his lap, while Max lay motionless by the front door, eyes wide open, ears twitching at every sound outside. The forest beyond the cabin walls had turned quiet, too quiet, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Walter glanced at the old clock above the mantel. 5:12 a.m., still dark. The first rays of sunlight hadn't yet crept over the trees, but he knew dawn wasn't far. He looked down at Max. "We move soon, buddy," he whispered. "Just hang in there." Max didn't move, but Walter could see the tension in his muscles, like coiled wire. The canine had picked up something Walter couldn't, something in the air or the earth or the silence. The wolves were back, not wandering, not curious, hunting. At 5:34 a.m., it happened. A sound, a low, guttural snarl, came from just outside the cabin. Max stood instantly, his body rigid, his hackles raised. Walter followed, grabbing his rifle and pushing the curtain aside just enough to peek through. 4 wolves, maybe 5. Their silhouettes moved between the trees, silent and deliberate. This wasn't a random pass-through. This was organized. They had returned for Max. Walter stepped back and inhaled deeply. He knew how wolves hunted. He knew they'd test the perimeter, try to isolate their target, go for the weak link. But Max wasn't weak. And Walter wasn't about to let him fight alone. He placed a hand on Max's head. "I didn't leave my brothers behind in Nam, and I'm not leaving you behind now." He opened the back door slowly and stepped into the icy air, Max limping at his side. The snow crunched beneath them. A pale orange glow began to peek behind the trees. It was nearly dawn. Walter raised the rifle, aiming toward the dark shapes circling beyond the clearing. "I've faced men twice as mean as you," he muttered. "You want this dog, you'll have to come through me." Max stood in front of Walter now, despite the limp, positioning himself between the man and the wolves. He was silent, unmoving, a soldier. The first wolf lunged. A thunderous crack split the air as Walter fired, sending snow and bark flying. The wolf skidded to a halt and retreated into the shadows, yelping. But the others didn't run. They fanned out instead. Max barked. A powerful, commanding sound that echoed through the trees like a command from deep within his soul. Walter's heart surged at the sound. That was the bark of a leader, a survivor, a warrior. 2 wolves crept in from the left. Walter pivoted and fired again, missing but keeping them at bay. Max sprang forward with a surprising burst of strength, landing in front of one of the advancing wolves, snarling, biting, driving it back. Then came the moment Walter had feared. His rifle jammed. He fumbled to clear it, but age and the old slowed him. One of the wolves leapt. Walter braced for impact, but it never came. Max intercepted mid-air, knocking the wolf to the ground in a blur of fur and snow. The 2 animals rolled, snapping and biting, until Max's jaws clamped down on the attacker's leg. The wolf yelped and retreated, limping into the trees. Walter managed to fix the jam and raise the rifle again, but the wolves had had enough. Their leader wounded, their surprise lost, they slinked back into the forest. It was over. Max collapsed in the snow, panting, his body trembling from exertion. Walter rushed to him, dropping to his knees. "Max, you're okay, son," You're okay." The dog looked up at him, eyes cloudy but calm. He gave a soft whimper and rested his head in Walter's lap. The sun finally rose behind them, bathing the blood-streaked snow in a warm golden light. Walter sat there for a long time, stroking Max's fee, whispering words meant to soothe them both. Eventually, Dana's truck appeared down the long road to the cabin. They were late, but they were here. As the door opened, Walter looked up and called out, "We had a little trouble, but we're ready now." Max stirred slightly, then fell still again. Walter didn't realize yet that Max's breath was slower than it should have been, or that something inside his brave companion had broken during the fight. The battle was over, but a heartbreaking goodbye was coming. Dana rushed from her truck the moment she saw Walter waving her down. Behind her, the young vet scrambled with her medical bag, boots sinking into the snow. The clearing still held the scent of fear and blood, though the wolves had long since vanished into the woods. Walter was kneeling in the snow beside Max, his arms wrapped protectively around the canine's body. "He's breathing," he said hoarsely, "but it's shallow, real shallow." The vet dropped to her knees, immediately assessing Max. She pressed her stethoscope against his chest, fingers moving quickly along his ribs and abdomen. Dana stood nearby, her face tight with worry. "BP's low," the vet murmured. "Pulse is thready. He's in shock." "He pushed past his limits, Mr. Briggs. He may have internal injuries." Walter looked down at Max, who was still, his head resting in the crook of Walter's arm. "He saved my life," he whispered. He didn't hesitate. The vet nodded. "It's what they do." "Is he going to make it?" Dana asked gently. There was a long pause. "I don't know," the vet finally said. "But if we have any chance, we need to get him to the mobile unit now. He's holding on, barely." Walter looked down at Max again. The dog opened one eye, just one. And for a brief second, it was clear and calm. It focused on Walter, just him, and then slowly closed again. "Come on, Max," Walter said, his voice trembling. "You're a damn hero. Don't you go out like this." They loaded Max into the truck as carefully as possible, laying him on a blanket in the back seat. Walter insisted on riding beside him. He refused to leave Max's side, even for a second. As the truck rumbled down the snowy road toward the ranger station, Walter kept one hand on Max's chest, feeling the rise and fall. But each breath was weaker than the last. Dana drove as fast as she could, tires skidding slightly on icy patches. Every mile felt like a lifetime. Walter could hear the vet on the phone with the Denver VA, trying to arrange a transfer for Max to be reunited with Sergeant Rhodes. That reunion, that miracle. They were so close. But Walter couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping through his fingers. Max stirred once, barely. Just enough to lift his head for a fraction of a second. Walter leaned in, voice low. "You did good, son. You came home. You held the line. Just hang on a little longer." The dog's ear twitched. Then, stillness. Walter froze. The vet turned in her seat, reached back, and pressed her fingers gently against Max's chest. She didn't speak. She just looked at Walter and shook her head. "No," Walter whispered. "No, no, no." The truck rolled to a stop on the side of the road. Dana turned off the engine. There was nothing to say. Walter placed both hands on Max's fur, now damp with melted snow and sweat. His fingers trembled. "You weren't supposed to go," he murmured. "Not like this. We had more to do." He leaned forward and pressed his forehead gently against Max's. "You weren't just a dog. You were a soldier. You were my soldier." The world felt unbearably quiet. Even the forest, just beyond the trees, seemed to bow in mourning. Back at the ranger station, they wrapped Max in a navy blue military blanket, the kind used at K9 funerals. Dana offered to call the army to organize a proper burial, but Walter stopped her. "No," he said, standing straight, voice clear. "He stays here, with me. He earned his rest, and he earned it on my land." A few days later, under the shadow of the old pine tree behind the cabin, Walter buried Max with full honors. Dana brought a local police unit with their K9s to stand in salute. Walter gave a eulogy, simple and raw. He was brave when no one was watching. He fought when others ran, and he loved fiercely, even after everything he'd lost. Max didn't just survive, he saved lives, including mine. The wind blew gently through the trees, as if carrying Max's spirit up into the hills. But just when Walter thought it was over, just when grief settled fully into his bones, Dana handed him a letter. "It came today," she said, "from Sergeant Rhodes." Walter opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a single sentence. "If Max is alive, then I owe him, and you, my life. Please let me see him." Walter looked down at the small wooden cross he had carved for Max's grave. Tears welled in his eyes. "I'm sorry, son," he whispered. "We almost made it." They buried Max beneath the tall pine where the sunrise always touched first. Walter carved his name into a stone, placed it by the wooden cross, and sat beside it every morning. A week later, a black SUV pulled into the snowy clearing. Sergeant Dean Rhodes stepped out slowly, leaning on a cane, the scars on his face still healing. He looked at Walter, then at the grave. His lips trembled. "He saved me in Kandahar," Dean whispered. "Took shrapnel to protect my unit. They told me he died. I never stopped dreaming of him." Walter stood in silence and placed something in Dean's hand, a small military medal, dented, old. "He didn't die out there," Walter said. "He came home. He protected one more person." Dean dropped to his knees before the grave, tears dripping silently into the snow. No words were needed. Just grief. Just memory. Just love. Winter turned to spring. The grave remained untouched, flowers blooming each morning at its base. Walter, though older now, walked with a purpose again. He and Dean built a small wooden sign on the edge of the road. "Max's Rest, a place for heroes." Soon, others came. K9 handlers, veterans, dog lovers. They brought collars, photos, medals. Left them by Max's grave. A child once asked Walter, did he know how much he mattered? Walter smiled gently. He didn't need to know. He just did what was right. And in that clearing, beneath the pine tree, the story of one K9 German Shepherd became something bigger. A reminder to everyone passing through, loyalty doesn't die, courage doesn't fade, and love always finds its way home. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Share it with someone who believes in second chances, and in the silent heroes who walk beside us, even after they're gone.